Of the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast. I'm your host, Heidi E. Wilcox, bringing you conversations with authors, thought leaders, and people just like you who are looking to connect where your passion meets the world's deep need. Today on the podcast, we are continuing the series we started last time with Dr. Christine Pohl. Today, we're talking about community and her book, Living into Community. Dr. Pohl taught at Asbury Seminary for 29 years, and she is the Professor Emeritus of Christian Ethics at Asbury Seminary. Today on the podcast, as I said, we continue the conversation on community. We learn what a healthy community looks like, how we can really live in a healthy community. We unpack the essential practices that she focused on in her book of promise-keeping, truth-telling, gratitude, and hospitality, what those deformations are, and how we can start cultivating those healthy practices in our own lives so that we can be transformed people that others want in their own communities. Let's listen. I'm really excited to have you back on the podcast, Dr. Pohl, and to get to talk to you a little bit more about community and the different things, different elements that make up a community, because I think we all kind of have an idea of what community is, but I'm not sure all of our ideas are a healthy community. I know I was definitely enlightened about not knowing just what a community is, but seeing some areas in my own life and the relationships with others. Then I'm like, yes, I have community, but it's not always a vulnerable, authentic community because maybe I'm not willing or others aren't willing to share the deeper things inside them. So I'm really looking forward to going deeper with today's conversation.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So some of the practices that you mentioned in your book, Living into Community, that make up a healthy community are promise-keeping, truthfulness, gratitude, and of course, hospitality. So can you give us a little bit of a picture of what a healthy community looks like, whether that's an example of healthy communities you've been a part of or just kind of what an ideal community would look like?
Well, I'll give it a try.
Okay.
Let me start out by saying those are the four practices that I focused on.
Okay.
But there certainly are other really important practices, like forgiveness or discernment or some version of keeping Sabbath or worship and prayer and so on. So I don't want to suggest that these are the only four that are crucial for healthy or good community. But I do think they're really central to shaping and maintaining a good community. So I think to try to address your question, I think a healthy community is one that actually embodies these practices, that lives out the practices in the way in which people relate to one another. So the Gospel of John says that Jesus was filled with grace and truth. It's a wonderful picture. And that should be true of us as his followers and true of our communities. And I think these four practices are particular expressions of grace and truth. And so then it helps to ask ourselves, well, what are the relational dynamics of grace and truth? What do grace and truth look like when they're lived out in relationships in a community? And in a community that is healthy, I mean, I think we could say that people would live with one another truthfully. There wouldn't be a lot of pretense or posturing or pretending. People would make and keep promises. You'd see a culture of celebration and gratitude, a community of welcome and hospitality. But I think I'm cautious with the notion of ideal communities because I don't think there are any. Communities aren't perfect. They never are. And there are always challenges that come from different directions. But sometimes we fail in a practice, we don't tell the truth, or even we find that one practice makes doing another one more challenging. So maybe you want to be hospitable and welcome one another, but you also need to speak truthfully, maybe a difficult truth. And sometimes those can feel a bit at odds with each other. And I think that's when the healthy community also needs to be practicing confession and forgiveness, reconciliation and discernment. So there's a lot of practices at work in a good community. Okay.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when I was working on hospitality, which was my first kind of big project on a practice, that's where I really saw that all the practices interact with each other, and the deformations or the failures in practices affect other practices. So just for example, we would think that gratitude is really important in a
Mm-hmm.
good community, but sometimes it's not functioning very well, but you still want to do hospitality. But hospitality without gratitude is really grudging. And grudging hospitality is not good for anybody. So you can sort of see how failure in one practice actually affects another one.
For sure.
So I've really liked looking at the intersections of practices. I think actually that's some of the most interesting and most complicated dimension of this work. But I would say that a healthy community, a good community, is one that people want to be part of, which is funny, but I mean, so that they're not grudging about contributing or being there. They're glad to be together. And those communities are, I think, generous and grace-filled.
Yes, yes, for sure. I like what you said. I like what you said about grace and truth being part of it, because it doesn't have to be perfect, but it just has to be real and genuine. And yeah, so
Right, right.
yeah.
I think it's a terrible mistake to imagine that communities can be perfect. I think there's a lot of idealism about
Hmm.
community, and almost inevitably people are going to be disappointed because we're frail. We make mistakes. We fail each other.
Hmm.
And so we have to be prepared for that too.
Yeah. So, what do we do? I mean, and I guess first of all, I should ask, when you talk about community, are you talking about an intentional community? Like, I maybe I'm thinking incorrectly, but with an intentional community, I think of maybe something like a monastery or something along those lines. Or are you addressing like church communities, small groups, even just communities in neighborhoods? Like, is there a specific type of community, or is it all community?
Well, to a certain extent, because these are human practices, I think they apply to all communities.
Hmm.
Because the way that I've looked at them also has kind of a Christian dimension to it. I would say that I was thinking about communities at many different levels of
Hmm.
complexity and number and that kind of thing. So this can apply to, I'm certainly thinking about church congregations,
Okay.
but also intentional communities. I think most of the time this applies to families in terms of how we relate to one
Interesting.
another. I mean, those
Yeah,
are
say
just,
more about families, because most of us have some type of family, whether we're, yeah. So, how does it relate to family?
well, I think families survive by the promises they've made to one another. So making and keeping promises, fidelity to one another is really crucial. Families are much happier places if people practice gratitude toward one another and so
Yes.
on. So the practices make as much sense in terms of small groupings, whether it's a small group or a family. What you have with a family is a community that really needs to last over time in a way that
Hmm.
some of the other ones aren't quite
Yeah.
as, um, you know,
Yeah.
decades and decades of life together.
Yeah. And you hope that you like each other for
Well,
the long
yeah, I
haul.
mean, it
Yeah.
helps, doesn't it? Yeah.
It really does. So, we talked about this earlier, the grace and truth that goes into communities, and that's kind of a balance that you have to strike. What do you do when the balance gets off? Like you mentioned, what if, somebody isn't always telling the truth, or telling the truth in the way that you need to hear the truth, or there's some type of conflict or moral failure or deformation in the community? How do you maintain community when things go wrong?
I think in terms of when things go wrong, and we'll probably have to unpack the practices and the deformations a little bit more, but
Yes.
when things go wrong, part of the key dynamic is that oftentimes people sort of cut and run.
Okay.
And so, one of the crucial things about being able to move toward reconciliation and healing and rebuilding is being willing to stay at the table, staying connected, not cutting ties, not cutting conversation, but maintaining conversation and relationships as much as possible. And
Hmm.
so avoiding gossip, avoiding assigning to the other people with whom you disagree or who've disappointed you, being careful not to continually assign bad motives to them, finding ways to rebuild what's been broken.
So let's go back then, and we can unpack each practice that you focus on in your book, and then we'll talk about the deformations and then some ways that we can start cultivating the practices that we want to have in our lives so that we can be people who are transformed and that others want to be part of their communities. So the practices that you focused on are promise keeping, truth telling, practicing gratitude, and hospitality. So let's start with promise keeping and just unpack each one at a time.
It's funny, especially with making and keeping promises and telling the truth or living truthfully. Mostly we don't notice them unless something goes wrong.
Yes.
But making and keeping promises is crucial to any relationship, as I was saying about families. But if you think about the marriage vows or the ordinary promises we make to do something, when we say, I'll pick up the kids, we depend on each other. And this is how we build trust, because promises set up expectations. They take away some of the unpredictability of life. And so we depend on each other to keep the promises we make. And that can be on small things, like maybe picking up the kids, or it can be on really big ones, like staying faithful in a marriage. But promising is related to faithfulness and fidelity, and we worship a God who is faithful and true. And God keeps promises, right? We worship a covenant-keeping God. So it's not surprising that we as God's people should be taking seriously both promise-making and promise-keeping. So when we do what we say we'll do or stay with someone or something when we've made a commitment but it's become difficult, we're doing something important for the relationship. I think it's important to talk about this because being willing to make commitments, to make promises in this culture is difficult. Our culture really likes to keep our options open.
Yes.
And that actually means that we're very hesitant about making promises. We don't want to make promises in case something better comes along. And yet that's a really hard way to live.
Yeah. Constantly living with that fear of missing out.
That's right. Yeah. And so then you sort of settle for much less rich relationships and so on, just because you're waiting in case something better comes along. So keeping promises is really crucial to maintaining any significant relationship.
As you said, there's a relationship between each of the practices. And so promise keeping would then tie pretty well directly into truth telling. Is that right?
Yes, actually, even in scripture, the two of them are so closely related sometimes that you sometimes it's translated as faithfulness, which would be more like promise keeping, and sometimes it's translated as truth. But yes, they're very closely connected. And of course, the deformations like betrayal and deception are also very closely connected.
Yes.
But I think in terms of truth telling, and when I was working on the project, I realized that truth telling was not a big enough category for truthfulness. I mean, that's a piece of it. But truthful living, I think, oftentimes captures a little bit more of what we need to be attentive to. Truth telling is an important part of it. But when we talk about truth telling, I think a lot of times people think of things they don't want to say or the other person doesn't want to hear or whatever. So it always seems kind of harsh. And yet living truthfully is bigger. It has to, it has to do with remembering that Jesus tells us that he is the truth. And we want to live in a way that reflects biblical value of the way that the Bible values truthful living. So it's not just about saying hard things, because lots of truth that could be spoken is affirming and encouraging truths, positive things we might say about one another or what we see in one another, but we're not used to thinking about it that way. So that's actually where truthfulness and gratitude intersect.
Okay.
Right? Where you recognize what goodness a person brings into your life.
Yeah. So let's move on, and I think you're going there. Let's move on and talk about gratitude now then.
Sure. And again, gratitude is really involves living in response to the grace that we've received. It's not just an occasional saying thanks or something. It's really a posture for how we live. And I think it means sort of cultivating an awareness of the gifted, as one person put it, the giftedness of our existence, our whole existence. And so that means gratitude to God, practicing gratitude toward one another, and then gratitude essentially is a posture for life or a way of life. And I
Hmm.
think that involves paying attention. A lot of times we just kind of rush our way through things. We don't notice the grace and gratitude around us. We don't name the blessings that we
Yes.
have received or the ways that people have been God's grace in our life. So here again, it involves truthfulness, because if you have sort of gratitude or affirmation without truthfulness, you end up with something like flattery, which is sort of a dishonest affirmation. But gratitude kind of spills from or into truthful affirmation and even celebration.
Yeah.
Karl Barth said that if the essence of God is grace, then the essence of human beings as God's people is our gratitude. I
Oh,
love
that's
that.
good.
Yeah, I love that quote. He also says that grace and gratitude fit together like the voice and an echo. And I think those are wonderful pictures of responding to the grace that we've received from God, but also from one another in a way
Mhm.
that echoes back that grace.
Would you say that hospitality then is one of the ways that that grace gets echoed back?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, because once again, I mean, hospitality, I think for Christians is a response to the grace we've received, the welcome that we've received from God in Christ, so that, it's still, if we're aware of it, if we're sensitive to the extraordinary welcome that we've received, then it's going to spill out in
Hmm.
gratitude and expressions of hospitality and so on. So we're living in a way that replicates, that corresponds and responds to God's welcome.
Yeah. So now let's talk about each of the deformations. So, because from your book, what I learned was that we can, at least I can be practicing some of the deformations and not even realize it. So I think it's really helpful because, as you said in your book, we have to be able to see it and name the deformations so that we can then, with God's grace, change it and go on to live transformed lives. So with promise keeping, the opposite or the deformation is betrayal. So can you talk to us about betrayal and what that would look like in a community?
Sure. Sure. And, you have big and little forms of
Yeah.
betrayal, right? But big betrayals, think about something like clergy misconduct, which is a
Hmm.
profound betrayal of the commitments one's made, the care for others in your congregation, and so on. So, but we can have betrayal in the form of not keeping promises, of gossip, or maybe repeating things we've been told in confidence. So it
Mm,
often looks like broken promises or a loss of trust. I think one of the things that struck me over the years is, if you think about children who for whom adults have failed in their lives, right? Who haven't
mm,
kept promises. And this has been a repeated experience. If you've worked with those kind of kids, you realize how hard it is for them to trust after that, what damage that kind of betrayal does. So
mhm,
it takes all sorts of forms. One of the things that struck me when I was studying betrayal was something like the biblical passages that describe the incidents around Jesus' crucifixion. And, Judas is a classic sort of example of betrayal, right? Betrays a friend with a
mhm.
kiss and so on. But Peter denies Jesus 3 times. That's also betrayal, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like it really kind of snuck up on Peter. He didn't realize that he was doing and something that significant until all of a sudden, after the third time and the cock crows, he realizes what he's done.
Yeah.
But it made me realize that a lot of betrayals are sort of small. I mean, maybe he thought he was going to stand in front of the Sanhedrin or the Pharisees or something or other, and, he would never deny Jesus there. But he does it with a servant girl or,
Mhm.
kind of in corners and so on. And then he's kind of caught by it. I think our forms of betrayal are a little bit more like Peter than Judas. But then I was thinking also, you have the betrayal of Pilate, who really betrays his office, his position,
Yeah.
by just thinking he can wash his hands of it and walk
Mhm.
away. So I think there are all different kinds of betrayal. They're incredibly destructive to relationships. It's a hard one to come back from. It requires a lot of confession and forgiveness.
Yes, definitely. So truth telling, the opposite, it's very closely tied to betrayal, but a little bit different.
Mhm.
The deformation is deception. So talk to us a little bit about that and what that might look like in our lives.
Right. Well, that's another one where you can have the really big lies, right?
Yes.
Where
And
somebody,
those are easy to recognize. So I think I was just
right.
interested in like the smaller ones, but like you were saying, just kind of sneak up on us. And I was thinking for myself, I'm like, oh, sometimes I'm not always the person that I think I am, you know?
Right. And that actually, we'll talk about that in a minute because that has to do with self-deception. Yeah. I mean, I think you see deception we're really in the habit of putting what we'll call spin on things, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we ask how we can spin the situation so everything looks better and so on, but that's a form of deception. We do lots of exaggerating, photoshopping things, omitting relevant facts that are inconvenient or unbecoming, or we pretend to
Mm-hmm.
be something that we're not.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, sometimes it's flat out lying, but a lot of times it's more subtle. I think oftentimes it's wanting to look good. And so we stretch the truth just a little bit this time, and then it becomes easier to do it the next time. I think there are some cultural things that make it easier at this point to be willing to engage in like little deceptions. One has to do with sort of the attitude of what we'll do whatever it takes to accomplish something.
Yes.
And, if what it takes is a little bit of deception, oh, well, it was for a good goal. And it's like people don't realize that by doing that, they're going to miss the goal. You can't get to a good goal by bad means, by deception.
Right.
And so that becomes, I think, a tendency. That's what you see with cheating. So when someone cheats on an exam or something and says, well, I just had to get into that good school or something. And it's like, really? At what price? And so on.
Right. Yeah.
But I think we also see problems with self-deception.
Oh, how so?
Yeah, I think this is a vulnerability of religious people in particular because we want to be good and we want to see ourselves as good, but we also want to do what we want. And,
Right.
and so sometimes we sort of work to fool ourselves, to hide from ourselves what it is we're doing. And sometimes we give it different names. We use euphemisms, or we just put it in another category so we don't notice it, or we just sort of overlooked it or whatever. But it's the way that we work to sort of help ourselves think of ourselves as maybe better than we are.
We all do that. And as you were talking, and it's not okay. I've just like my words kind of just passed it off as we all do that. But I don't mean that because I need to fix that. But I was thinking of social media too, and its
Mm-hmm.
presence in our lives as
Mm-hmm.
part of the truth telling or not truth telling game, because we can make our lives look so good, so easy, and it doesn't really reflect the truth. Because I think of couples that, maybe I'm not sure I've known any, but I've known people who knew couples like this, that their lives on social media look perfect. And then 6 months later, you find out, oh, they're getting a divorce. And so these pictures aren't telling us the true story, that maybe they need help, or, people to come alongside them, or counseling or something like that. So,
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's that terrible tendency to hide our weaknesses and try again to look better than we're doing. I mean, there's a way in which we want to, model good lives, but deception isn't going to help that very much.
right. It just leads to secret sins
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
not living a full life.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So moving on then to the deformation of gratitude, envy and grumbling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty common, I think.
Yeah.
I guess I'll do grumbling first, which is a
Okay.
really common deformation of gratitude. I mean, it's sort of being able always to see what's missing, how things should have been. Sort of, I think oftentimes it's kind of a generalized discontent, or being able to be critical without being constructive. I think grumbling is sometimes tied to sort of a disappointed idealism. Right. You set up
Oh,
impossible expectations and then you are going to be disappointed. Nothing's ever going to kind of live up to what you dreamed would be possible. So I think grumbling is highly contagious in communities. It
yes,
is like a virus. Once it gets
it is.
started, it's hard to stop it. And it can become a way of life. And it is actually extremely miserable.
Yes.
I was struck when I read the Rule of Benedict that he talked about what he called justifiable grumbling. And I
Oh,
thought that was a helpful warning. What he was talking about there was sort of legitimate criticism and distinguishing between that and grumbling. So
okay.
sometimes we could maybe accuse someone of grumbling or complaint when really what they're trying to do is provide truthful critique. And so I think we have to be careful not to misinterpret that as grumbling.
Hmm. Yes, definitely. So what about envy then? How do we
Envy.
envy is a big one. How do we recognize that in our lives?
Right. I don't think I understood before I started studying it just how serious envy was as a sin, especially in communities, just how destructive it was. Um, Kierkegaard wrote that envy is a small town sin. And when I first read that, I thought, what does that mean? But what he meant and observed, I think, is that envy is rooted in comparison. And we compare ourselves to people who are more or less like us or people who are nearby. Um,
Mhm.
and so it flourishes in close knit communities. But it's when we compare ourselves to other people. It's a sin that destroys community. It's wanting what someone else has, which would but I mean, which is more like coveting, wanting what someone else
Mhm.
has. But envy has another, a nastier, meaner element in it, which is also not wanting them to have it.
Oh, yeah.
And so Thomas Aquinas and other people in the tradition said that envy is sorrow for another's good. And
Oh,
and when you think about that, that is really horrible, right? To be sad and sorrowful because somebody else is doing well in some area.
yes.
Nobody wants to admit that, and so we hide
No.
it, right? We hide it. This is where deception and envy travel together. It's kind of a monster. But we can envy, this is where you start thinking about, you can envy another person's success, you can envy the recognition they get for something, you can envy their gifts, you can envy their happy family in a way that's so desperate and unhappy that you don't want them to have it because you don't have it or whatever. And so it's a plague in communities because we see into each other's lives. But I think basically it's tied to not seeing the gifts that we've been given
Yes,
and
I found that very interesting when you said that.
and wanting somebody else's gifts rather than seeing what God has given us. And I think it also has to do with not recognizing how much we are loved by God.
Oh,
So it comes out of a sort of, I think, in some ways, an emptiness, a deep need, but it's a very unhelpful deformation.
definitely. And so then moving on to hospitality, the deformation. I keep wanting to say opposite. I'm not sure that's the correct language. The deformation is exclusion. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think exclusion is tied to having too small a vision for a good community, sort of trying to hold on to what we have and holding on to it in a way that's so desperate that we can't let other people in. So we become fearful of strangers or protective of our things or our lifestyle or whatever, and kind of assuming that we're better off without those people, whoever they might be. And sometimes we do it by maybe seeing them as not a good enough return on our investment or too much trouble, or maybe they'll interfere with our way of life or they're too risky or too different. But we set up boundaries. We don't make room. I think sometimes it comes from a fear that welcoming some people might include they're bringing their commitments with them, and that could undermine our particular commitments. And that's really where fidelity and hospitality sometimes are really crucial, and sometimes they are challenging to try to hold them together at the same
Hmm.
time.
Hmm. You've talked about fidelity. Can you go ahead and define that for us? Because it's a word that we don't use very much today, and I feel like it has a deeper meaning than what we think of, or at least what I think of when I think of promise keeping and truth telling. What is fidelity?
Fidelity, in some ways, is a combination of both of those practices,
Okay.
just like integrity is.
Hmm.
But fidelity has the element of faithfulness to something or someone. But fidelity, so I think of fidelity as a bigger category.
Hmm.
But I think fidelity tends to, in some ways anyway, have us look back toward a commitment we've made and keeping that commitment. Promise keeping actually tends to be oriented toward the future. So they have a lot of the same elements, but they also are slightly distinct.
Yes,
So
that makes
we hear
sense.
a lot about faithfulness and fidelity in Scripture, being
Hmm.
faithful to the covenant and so on. That's mostly backward looking. But we also have promises and vows and so on that we make toward the future.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. That fidelity looks back mostly, promises look forward. So it's an all encompassing view of both the past, the present, and the future.
That's right. That's right. And they both impact, both looking backward and looking forward, both impact how we live now.
I love that. So now that we've talked about the formations and the deformations of these specific practices within a community, I know I had some revelations as we were talking, and as I was reading your book, Living into Community, especially regarding envy. I didn't quite realize the depth and nastiness of that particular deformation and truth telling, especially around living truthfully and self deceptions that I tell myself. I want to talk to us. I was hoping you would talk to us about some ways that we can start cultivating the formational practices. So even just I'm hoping it's simple because I need things to be simple for me to like do them.
I think we
So
all do.
yeah. So I'm hoping that we could just talk about each go through the formations then and talk about some ways that we can cultivate promise keeping. We'll start with that one.
Sure. I would say at this point, though, it's really important not to sort of think of these practices as one more task we should be doing.
Oh, that's a good word.
I I think if it just becomes just a duty or just working harder, it's going to make them very burdensome. They represent pieces of a way of life, so that they have this goodness that's inside of them. And I think that goodness comes from God's grace. And so the practices apart from grace would be very burdensome. So I think paying attention to that and recognizing there are things that we can do to make these practices more vibrant in our lives, but it's God's love and grace that make them possible.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm glad
And
you said that because yeah, I
yeah,
can
and that
definitely just have tasks that I'm like, oh, I need to be kinder. So we'll work on that and check it off. And that's not really the rhythm that I
no,
want in my life. Yeah.
no, it's not. It's really we're talking more about a way of life. We're sort of breaking apart a way of life, but it's a way of life lived in response to the grace that we've received.
Hmm.
So, in terms of particulars about how we might foster promise keeping, one of the things we can do, especially if we're in mentoring relationships or teaching or leadership roles, is to help people learn to count the cost before they make promises.
Oh.
Some people make promises very casually, but then don't really recognize that you can't possibly fulfill all the things you've promised, and you become kind of a habitual promise breaker. So helping people count the cost can be good. I think we can honor fidelity where we see it, where we see people being faithful over time, where they've kept their promises in difficult situations or over the long term. I think that needs to be celebrated more than it often is, because it's not very dramatic. It doesn't call attention to itself, but it's that steady faithfulness. I think there are people who have a lot of commitments, and sometimes they seem overwhelmed and burdened by them. And so I think sometimes we can help people by helping them to get kind of a right ordering of their commitments,
Uh-huh.
so that it's not so overwhelming. Actually, that could be an experience of freedom. Rather than feeling
Yes.
bound by promises, you could feel free by getting them kind of in the right order.
Yeah. When is it appropriate to release? Because you're kind of talking about that. When is it appropriate to release someone or even ourselves from promises that we've made?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a very long conversation in the Christian tradition,
Yeah.
and in philosophy. Actually, philosophers talk about conditions that defeat a promise. I always thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Conditions that defeat a promise, but there are reasons that we don't always keep our promises. Although it's really important that we do almost all of the time. But sometimes the conditions change, so the promise is no longer relevant. If you've promised to stay with somebody for a week while they recover from surgery, but actually they recover within a couple of days, I mean, it makes the promise not particularly relevant to the situation anymore.
Right.
Sometimes a person can't fulfill the promise they've made, And so it's important to release them. I mean, maybe their circumstances have changed dramatically and they just can't do what they genuinely thought they could do and would
Mm-hmm.
do. Sometimes a much more pressing need appears, and it sort of makes you have to choose the pressing thing over the promise thing because there's such a difference in sort of the magnitude of importance.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and this is a conversation in the moral tradition, but I think that when we do break promises, it's not like the promise just disappears. We still owe the person that we've made the promise to some recognition that it's been, it may have been costly to them. If you're driving along and, you come upon an accident and you're the only one who can help the person, of course you're going to stop, even though you promised to be at a meeting, right? And there's a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of people waiting for you. Well, it's not like the obligation to those people goes away just because you needed to do it. I mean, you still owe those people something for the fact that they waited an hour and a half for you without knowing what happened or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you still owe an apology or an effort to, make it right in some way. It doesn't just disappear, which is what sometimes people imagine, that the promise just goes away if you can't do it or something. I don't think it does, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. As we're talking about promise keeping, what is the relationship between perseverance and keeping your promise?
That's an interesting question. I think, there are some promises that you kind of like, you make the promise and you deliver on it very in very close amount of time, right? So you promise that you'll cook dinner tonight or, pick up the kids tomorrow or whatever. It doesn't require a lot of perseverance. You just need to do it and it'll be done.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, keeping marriage vows over decades does sometimes require perseverance, or ordination vows during a difficult period or whatever requires that we hang in there during tough times, that we press on to be faithful to the promise and the people we've made the promise to. So
Mm-hmm.
it's crucial for long-term commitments, especially when we encounter obstacles.
Mm-hmm. Is it ever okay when we encounter obstacles? Is it ever okay to rescind our promise?
I think you can. Yes, I mean, I think there are times where we do have to reconsider, when the circumstances or the obstacles have become enormous. Then I think that oftentimes requires truthful conversations. It can be very difficult, right? Because promises are important to relationships and it can be a huge fracturing of trust. But there are times when communities do have to rethink their promises. And I think, again, then all of the other practices become important.
So, moving on to truth telling, what are some ways? Because it's not just speaking the truth, it's living truthful lives, as we learned in today's conversation. So, what are some ways that we can start practicing a lifestyle of truth telling?
Well, I think we can start by recognizing its importance and pushing back against a culture that increasingly disregards the significance of truth. I think we need to talk about it, we need to recognize it, and we need to practice it. I
Hmm?
don't think that bluntness is the same as truth.
Oh,
Or
yeah, yeah.
truthfulness. I think we can use kindness. I mean, we need to use kindness and care when we are speaking the truth, and it certainly requires discernment. If you think about it, we can be truthful without necessarily saying everything we know. We can be truthful with children, especially, and still not say everything about something. We use discernment, but I think it's really important that fidelity, so sort of the promising piece, is fully present when we do difficult truth telling. If the person can't be sure that you actually care about them, that you love them, it becomes harder to hear the truth. And I think it's
Hmm.
easier to do difficult truthfulness in contexts where there's been a lot of positive truths spoken as sort of part of everyday life, so that
Hmm.
you have sort of a fabric that holds the person as you're dealing with difficult things.
One of the examples that I remember from your book was about a couple in a church who was having difficulties in their relationship. So I believe it was, if I'm remembering right, the wife in the couple went to their pastor at the time, spoke with him about the situation, but didn't want the pastor to tell her husband that she had talked to him. So it kind of created this awkward triangle as the pastor encouraged the couple to get counseling, they went forward and did that, and their marriage, they stayed together. And then, but because the pastor knew of some of their issues, it created some difficulties down the road when the husband wanted to advance in the area of ministry in the church and take on more leadership responsibilities. So I thought that example was especially relevant to our audience. I guess I'm just not sure, how do you honor being truthful to the wife, being truthful to the husband, being truthful to the couple?
Right. It's probably a promise he should not have made to the
Yeah,
wife.
talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Promises
I
that
mean,
we should not make.
there are times when you shouldn't agree to keep certain things in confidence, and that was probably something that he learned a little bit late in that situation, because it really did. I mean, it caused enormous problems later on when the husband couldn't understand why the church resisted his moving forward. And the pastor was trying to be faithful to the promises that he made, and at that point he had made that promise. So I think again, sort of issues around confidentiality and truthfulness and so on are complicated, and
Yeah.
they can have long-term consequences that can be very helpful or destructive to a community and to relationships.
How can we start telling the truth to ourselves? Because I think that's the tricky part, because we know ourselves the best, but maybe we don't know ourselves completely. And I think it's easy to do kind of more smoke and mirrors when we're dealing with ourselves. So how can we start telling ourselves the truth?
Well, I think it can help to have other people around us who
Yeah.
help us see the truth about ourselves. That might challenge us when we try to describe what we're doing differently. I think there can be kind of a willful not seeing. So, I mean, I think it involves a prayer for kind of a clear vision, a willingness to. I think part of it's tied again to wanting to be good, which is a good thing, but it can be blinding in the sense that we can't admit our frailties, or we're afraid to admit our sins. And I think we just have to recognize that God loves us and wants for us something better, something truer, even if it's hard to see it.
Is it ever okay to lie?
Oh dear.
I know you
You're
kind of talked about that in your book.
you're
And I
asking
feel
an
like,
ethicist a question that has like filled many volumes.
yes, I know.
Um, Mostly, no, it's not okay to lie
Uh
because we
huh.
love the truth. I mean, we can look at, we worship a God who is truth, who loves the truth, who tells us to live the truth and speak the truth and so on. So there's a huge emphasis on truth and truthfulness in Scripture. But even in Scripture, very occasionally, people lie and don't seem to like get in trouble for it, right? So you have the Hebrew midwives who lie to Pharaoh and Rahab who lies about the spies and so on. But truth is central to God's character and ours, and it matters. And our tendency is not to do these big lies, but to do little ones that make life, maybe we think make life a little bit easier by not having to, have the disruption that comes sometimes with speaking more truthfully. It takes more work sometimes to figure out how to say hard truths in a helpful and kind way. And so we just opt for being untruthful. But I think we can choose silence sometimes over lying, and we can always choose discernment and kind of consider the word that might be fitly spoken for a particular situation. So I think there probably are incredibly rare occasions where someone's life is. I mean, these are always the classic examples where someone's life is at stake, and if you tell them the person's going to get killed, or if you tell the person who's pursuing them or something. I it may be necessary to lie, although there's real differences in the tradition about this. But I think that again, there still is reason for regret, even in doing that kind of lying, because it makes a terrible. You're forced into a terrible choice in a terrible situation. It doesn't make it go away that it was a lie, and there's some undermining of the humanness, I think, of the people involved when we're forced into that situation. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, it is. Probably much longer than we have today, but I appreciate you talking to us just a little bit about it. So, moving on to gratitude. How can we cultivate the practice of gratitude in our lives?
Well, I think sometimes when I talk about gratitude, people sort of think of some kind of happy, clappy, always optimistic, sunny kind of approach to life. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about knowing that the God we worship is a God of grace and responding with grace and gratitude to God and living that way in the world. But I think that a posture of gratitude and thanks is actually a way in which we are better able to encounter or to challenge evil and injustice and misery and so on. I mean, knowing that we're held by a loving God who gives us strength and courage allows us to address some of the really difficult things. So I don't see gratitude as sort of an alternative to justice or responsibility or something like that. I actually see it as an important component of working on those issues. But I think to practice it, often it means slowing down to notice what's around us, especially to notice the good around us, which we often take for granted, and learn to pay attention to what is good and to tell stories and retell stories of God's faithfulness, to remember the blessing, even just simple practices, which lots of people do, of expressing gratitude first thing in the morning to God and possibly to others around you. And at the end of the day, kind of recounting the blessings of the day can be really helpful in terms of cultivating a life of gratitude. I think oftentimes practicing celebration is a form of gratitude. Celebration is not just a nice extra if we have the time. Celebration is an important practice that's closely related to gratitude. But celebration, as one person put it, is a way in which what we're aiming for is kind of made present in our lives for that bit of time of the celebration. And so it becomes really important that we have those times and rejoice in them. And I think we can, another friend said that we can learn to catch people in the act of being a gift, which is I think, a very beautiful way of thinking about some of the people in our lives who do express God's grace to us in so many, oftentimes small and unnoticed ways.
Yeah, definitely. So, hospitality, we had a whole episode last time about hospitality, but I want to stay true to our form. So, what are some ways that we can cultivate the practice of hospitality in our lives?
Right. I think for one thing, we want to distinguish it from entertaining
Yes.
or trying to make an impression. Those are really unhelpful kind of misunderstandings of hospitality. I think hospitality is about really sharing ourselves, inviting people into our lives in a sense as we live them. We need to resist using hospitality as a means to another end. Hospitality itself is just a good practice, a life-giving practice. I think what can be really helpful is to think about times when you've really felt welcomed and identify the elements. What was it that made you know that the person was glad you were there? And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
oftentimes it's because that person seemed genuine, or that community seemed genuinely interested in you. They found you interesting, and they didn't treat you like you were an interruption into their important activities. You were valued, and so I think they're being able to make a place for you in their lives is some of the ways in which hospitality is expressed, so that you can turn your own experiences sort of around in that and say, okay, those are the ways that I could also communicate to someone that they were welcome. And so just kind of working on that. So
Yeah.
oftentimes people who have been strangers make the best hosts because they
Yeah.
know what it feels like.
Yeah, definitely. We're still recording in the middle of a pandemic, so we're doing it remotely. How has this pandemic informed your view of community? Has it changed it at all, or just kind of reinforced what you already thought and knew about community?
It has made me really grateful for Zoom. And I think I probably assumed that the most important kinds of community life had to be face to face. But I must say that Zoom and sort of various forms of digital or electronic communication or whatever, it's actually turning out to be pretty important. I mean, it's no substitute, and I think people are realizing that it can't be the only thing. We are desperate for, the physical connections that we took for granted for so long, so often. But I think the kinds of connections that we're having to make, the creativity that we're having to come up with to sustain community. I'm not sure that it's all that easy to create new communities right now, but there are
Mm-hmm.
ways in which we can sustain ones that we have by, again, probably we see the importance of maintaining community, especially with the people who are the most vulnerable, who are the most likely to fall out of community. So we have to work a
Mm-hmm.
little bit harder there. Yeah, I think it has, the pandemic, at least for some people, has tended to slow us down a little bit to be more
Mm-hmm.
attentive to what's right around us,
Yeah.
to immediate family and finding good things to do, or immediate communities and so on, and valuing that.
Yeah. My hope is that when we come out of this, because I am hopeful that we do come out of this and that this ends for everyone, but I hope it helps us all do community better because we realized how much we need it and that digital connection is great and we so need it right now, but that it's no substitute for the real thing.
Right, right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
We're probably talking to people who are leaders within communities, whether that's a church community or a neighborhood, or who are going to be a leader in a community or who want to be. So, all these practices, they probably require that we create some boundaries. So, how can we create the boundaries that are necessary to maintain the practices for a healthy community, whether that's small group or church or something like that?
Well, I think I'm not exactly sure what you mean by creating boundaries. I think we can maybe be more explicit about definitions
Okay.
and help people be clearer about what it is that they're looking for and trying to build. I think it can actually be helpful to preach and teach directly on some of these practices because it's not a
Okay.
language people are familiar with, or at least not very familiar with. By teaching or preaching on it, it helps folks pay more attention to them. One of the things that I discovered was that it was much easier for people to notice the failures in practices than to see them when they were working well. And that's because they don't usually call attention to themselves when they're working well. So it really does help to talk about it, to define it, to see how it might be, see how a particular practice might be worked out in life together. And I think one of the reasons it's important is because if we don't use the language of promising or truthfulness, we're going to tend to default to the language that's more familiar in the culture. And oftentimes that's psychological or therapeutic language. And so when things go wrong, we talk about somebody who's dysfunctional or codependent or whatever. And we miss the chance to notice that what's really going on is also that people are failing in the promises or the commitments they're making, or they've been dishonest or whatever. And actually using the language of practices or something like that, or virtues or whatever, allows us to access the resources of the scriptures and the Christian tradition much more readily.
Mhm.
So we can find wisdom for the difficulties that we face when we're actually a little bit more tied into things like the practices. Again, I think that it can help leaders to reflect a little bit more on how all of these practices are, in a sense, responses to God's character, and that it simply means that this is who we need to be as God's people.
I think when I was asking that question, I was thinking of the example that you gave from Keith Wasserman and Good Works, where when I was thinking about the boundaries, where I'm not sure boundaries was the right word, but that he had, I guess, systems, if you will, or opportunities for truth telling. I believe that
Oh,
once a week he had opportunity, like check-in opportunities, where it was totally okay for people to tell the truth if things weren't going well or if they were going well, but it wasn't just I'm going to ask you the question and everything was fine. So I think that's what I meant with the boundaries to
right. So
cultivate
more like structures.
structures. Yes, that's a much better word. Thank you.
Okay, because boundaries has lots of meanings. But
Yes,
anyway,
yes, yes.
yeah, yes. Actually, Keith's structure at Good Works, kind of an arrangement that he calls clear, is something that the staff, the community does every week. And they go around and ask basically what they're asking is if all relationships among the staff, and there's about 20 or 25 of them sometimes, whether they're all in good order. And if they're not, then he recognizes that if there are really disordered relationships among the staff, they're going to have a hard time doing the kinds of work they need to do with people who are homeless. And so that needs to be addressed. So they don't address it in the meeting, but they do make sure that the people who acknowledge that something is wrong then take the time they need to reconcile.
I see. Are there other structures that we can put in place to help us as larger communities maintain these practices?
Yeah, I think that being more explicit about the promises we make and expect. A lot of communities function with sort of implicit promises or expectations. And I think it can be helpful, especially to newcomers, to have some of those expectations spelled out more clearly. Because especially as people come to faith from totally non-Christian backgrounds, they don't know what the expectations are, and they can end up being in trouble for things they didn't know they were doing wrong. And so I think another sort of structure is that regularly we can talk about what it is we're committed to, what it means to be faithful in the world, what it looks like to be a Christian. So I think sometimes being more explicit, even though that feels can even feel a little bit burdensome, can actually be pretty helpful.
Yes, definitely. It's all. I feel like it's always better to be upfront about what you want in anything. Yeah. I know too. I found from my own experiences with even just among my friend group community that the friends I appreciate the most are the ones who tell me the truth about my life that maybe I haven't seen, but they've heard me ruminate about an issue for a long time, and they're like, Heidi, what I think you really need to do based on what I hear you saying is maybe in this relationship with this particular group, or find a way to do it better or well. And being able to be vulnerable with those people and having them speak truth into my life has been very, very helpful.
Absolutely. And I think the Wesleyan tradition of the emphasis on small accountability groups and so on is really crucial. To have friends or a tiny community that really cares about you, that knows you, and that cares enough to speak the truth into your life, even though you might get aggravated with them or something,
Yeah.
can be enormously helpful in growing toward holiness and goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as many people at the seminary are starting small groups or in small groups or something like that, or people who aren't at the seminary are in small groups or accountability groups, what is one piece of advice that you would give to someone who is just starting out and wants to build that type of community? Maybe they don't have it, or they're in a group and they want to be able to go deep with their group.
Gosh.
That's a big question, isn't it?
It is a big question. I guess I would say, try to be what you're looking for. So if you're looking for a group that's truthful and vulnerable, then you need to be that kind of person. And to go in without, to go in with a recognition that all of us are going to make mistakes and fail each other in one way or another. And so to recognize that we're not aiming to sort of create this ideal little group or something, but we're aiming to kind of help each other along the way. I think being patient and persevering. I have a friend who talked about weaving a fabric of faithfulness, which is just that slow threading of the basically the threads that kind of hold us together. I think would be really crucial.
I think for me, when I've been in small groups before, I'm hesitant because I'm just joining the group. I really don't, sometimes at church, I don't really know the other people in the group. And so I'm hesitant to tell them too much about me too quickly. So, what is the balance between being vulnerable and then kind of self protection a little bit until you realize that you can build that trust?
Yeah, I think that's where it does take time, and groups are not. I mean, we do fail each other, and sometimes when people are willing to be vulnerable or share more about themselves than the group is ready to handle responsibly, it can be incredibly painful. And so I think you do it bit by bit, and you do some assessing. of the maturity level of the group. Even if you think about